This tutorial assumes that you've already unchunked the game and downloaded the plugin. The plugin is going to be on the description. It's also on the wiki. Same for the same for unchunking the game. And we're going to import. First, we want to import a base from the game of what we're replacing. In this case, we're going into the game files, and today we're going to be replacing a gunlance shield. It's relatively simple compared to player models, but it's the same workflow for the most part. We want a good in-game base, so we're gonna go into the wiki and look for a model which is somewhat close to what we want. In the case of shields, because they are relatively static and they don't have many moving parts or complex geometry, any would do really. The wiki has a listing of which files and folders map to which in-game item. Some weapons are made of two parts, a base and like monster parts to go on top. On this case, we're just going to use replace a unique, which is the Raytheon gunlance. So we import that model, and for the most part you'll be fine with the default settings, but I'm gonna walk you through a few of them so you know what they do. Clear scene before import is one that you'll be using if you want to import more than one in-game model at the same time. Maximize clipping distance is mostly used for monsters. For weapons, you don't really need it, and you should probably disable it if you're going to be using uniform perspective. Depending on uniform perspective, might have issues with high clipping distance. Only import high LOD parts is just not importing all of the LOD levels, because the game stores them as different meshes. The file headers are the metadata of the file. You normally only want to import this for the first model if you're importing multiple to the same scene. You can also use them if you've imported your own model and then just want the metadata, because you already have the custom properties. Preserve mesh skeleton independence is not something that you should ever untick. It's just legacy from when we were using other type of tooling. Import mesh part is just importing the meshes. You disable this if you just want to import the metadata. Import unknown mesh properties is also metadata, like the file header. Import textures is just good for visualization. You don't really need it. Import materials is also just basically just for rendering. These are the types of import skeleton. Empty tree is if you want to mod the game to export things back into the game, and animation armature if you want to export for outside say other games. So say don't import, it's just not going to import the armature. If you're importing multiple models, you probably don't want this for the second and onwards. As for weights, split slash is the most close to how the game actually stores things. This is if you're just importing and exporting and deleting mesh parts and not doing any minor adjustments of mesh geometry. Split weight is basically the same as split slash. For most cases you won't notice a difference. It's just that some models in the game are really broken. So like for example Gerald requires the first, while most others are happy with the second, and standard is just the usual weights. You shouldn't need to see all the other two types of weighting schemes unless you're working with specific things which are broken, and in which case you either have enough experience to know how to tackle them and you're fine, or you should not bother with them really. So we have the shield. As I said, most of the time for weapons the weighting schemes are relatively simple. These are the custom properties. All of this is the reason we need a game base, because we are going to be transferring this to the meshes of the object we bring in. The first one is the block label. The block label defines how the vertices behave inside of the file. In this case, II skin is just, you can ignore that. 4 weights means that each vertex can have at most 4 weights. UV is the number of UV maps. You normally don't need more than one. As for 4 weights, it means that one vertex cannot be weighted to more than 4 weights. You could have like 1,000 bone weights on the same mesh. It's just that each vertex cannot be weighted to more than 4 at the same time, and even 4 is pushing it. Normally you have 3 because of how the game stores things. In Blender you can see on the end panel to how many weights a vertex is weighted to, and in this case it's relatively simple. Like everything is just weighted to bone 003. And you can like see that it's not exactly rocket science, for at least for weapons. Weapons are relatively simple. And now we're gonna bring in the mesh that we want to actually replace this with. And so going through the custom properties, bone remap ID is not something you touch, LOD either, not really as well. Material is important because we're going to be using that on the Emerald free tutorial. Each mesh can have a material, so if you want different materials, you normally want them to be on separate meshes. The unknowns are just well, unknowns, and visibility condition determines if something is visible on what state. For weapons, 0 means always visible, 1 means unshift, and 2 means shift, and values above that really are always visible. The strap is for 4. Sometimes they use it for special effects, special conditions, effects as well. So we've pasted our new mesh, and we might have to do some rescaling, some adjustments, moving it around maybe, so that it kind of fits what we are replacing. In this case, I know for a fact that I can get away with that size because there's bigger shields. It's just aligning it properly with the strap so that the arm goes through. It's just there's not much technical here, it's just eyeballing it. And normally this is going to be an iterative process. You're going to export, you're going to see how it fits, and then you're going to import back. So there's not much going on there. We don't really need the shield, and we're not going to be working with the base outside of just transferring the properties, so we're going to move it to the side. So one of the things that's important is what do these file headers and metadata means, and this is going to be visible here because we're just like when you've imported the model from the game, you have all of this metadata. Those are the file header and the unknown mesh headers. If you have a clean Blender instance, like the one I'm showing here, you'll notice that the file has basically no metadata in that regard. So sometimes, even if your mesh has all of the properties of the meshes, you still need the headers for the scene to be set correctly. That's what the file header and the unknown mesh properties are. You can see the group properties are the unknown mesh properties, and the file headers. So now we're gonna collapse everything back so we have only the 3D view, and we're gonna start working on the first part is just transferring properties, which is a relatively mindless affair. What we do is we delete all of the vertices that are stored inside of a mesh, and then we're gonna be joining the new meshes into the old data blocks. So you normally want to transfer properties from similar things, so we'll probably want to transfer the strap properties to the strap and everything else into the shield. And we've got around 15 meshes on top of the strap, so this is just going to be a relatively trivial procedure. We eliminate the vertices, so we have an empty data block. We copy it for as many times we're going to be probably using it. We do the same for the strap. We should probably label the strap separately, since it's just one case and we'll probably want to work around with it. And then we join them. We join the old we join the new into the old. So you join the mesh into the data block, and now we have all of the properties that were on the strap before on our strap instead. You can also take the opportunity to weight things to the bone. In this case, because there's only one bone, it's relatively mindless procedure. And now comes the rather rote task of just joining one by one. There's not much going on here. Just grab the mesh, join, grab the mesh, join into the data block, and so on. And now we're done with that. So at this point, in theory, we could just export. We'll probably want to weight everything to the bones just to be sure. Sometimes what you're going to notice is that the center of geometry has changed, and that can be reset just by using set geometry to origin. Another thing is that you normally want to keep each material separate because, for example, in this case that was glass. So glass is going to be radically different. So we're going to change the material properties of objects, which we might want to treat differently in terms of materials. Like, for example, the coal, we might want to have some effects which aren't standard for the materials of normal objects. So we keep those as a separate mesh. How you manage meshes is up to you. It's just that because each mesh has to be tied to a single material can have, for example, wood and metal, but when you have things like glass or things which have required a shader to use displacements, things that require some sort of texture motion, you want to keep those as separate meshes on their own. And now we're just gonna weight each object to the only bone that there is on the shield. You might notice that you can just export, and without weights it will mostly work, but it's not really recommended. Even for weapons which are super simple and only have one weight, you want to be weighting to the bone. And removing extraneous groups which don't have anything weighted to them, it's the exporter would just ignore them, but it's just cleaner overall. This process is going to be relatively straightforward. There's not much science here. You just go one by one. You enter edit mode, select all vertices, and weight them to the one bone. If you had more complex rigging, you have to be weight painting. I'm not gonna cover that. There's entire libraries of tutorials dedicated to that, and weight painting is far from trivial once you start doing things which aren't as simple as just a chunk of metal. What we are gonna cover is a bit about CDCs and adding physics to some sections, because there's a specific procedure for that. In this case, something to note is that it doesn't matter that it's bone free to which things are weighted to. It's what's really determining what's moving and what not in game is the bone function. So you'll notice that we weighted everything to bone 003, and the bone names are meaningless. You can rename them whatever you want. It's just that the vertex group has to meet the name. In this case, bone 003 is bone function 1. It doesn't matter what the bone is called, as long as the bone has bone function 1, the mesh is going to be following that bone. So we could create a new bone, give it bone function 1, relabel the bone function to what was previously there, to another value, and it will follow the one that's on bone function 1. So at this point, we can add bones, and in particular, we're going to be covering that we're going to briefly be covering that because it's not exactly trivial. In particular, we're going to be adding a bone for the CDC. There's two types of collision capsules, CDCs which are jiggle physics, and CCLs which are the actual collision capsules which push things away. And for example, the way we add bones for jiggle physics is we add empties. In this case, we're gonna add a cube. It doesn't really matter which one as long as it's an empty. And we're gonna position it at we're gonna make the pipes jiggle a bit. And this is gonna be the root of the jiggling. It's not gonna move by itself, but it's gonna change angle. We're gonna be adding two properties to it. The two properties that define every bone, which are unknown and bone function. Now this is the end of the chain. All chains have to be at least size 2. They can be much bigger. And we roughly guesstimate where we want the physics to be happening. Obviously, I'm gonna go on later on this and clean up the exact values and the alignment. So this is normally controlled through the CDC, and the way we link the CDC with this is what I was meaning about clipping distance. We want to lower this for weapons because we're now on flat perspective, and our bones are more or less aligned, so that should be about fine. We're gonna add the two properties that define every single bone in the game. You'll notice them here. 1 second. Bone function and unknown 2. Unknown 2 is obviously unknown. We normally set it to 0, and bone function we normally set it to, for jiggle bones, you want to set them to a range of values which we know is not used by in-game hard-driven animations. For bone functions in weapons case, we're going to be using 150. Blender can be a bit picky about how you input values, so we have to manually do it on the edit property panel, and it's going to be 150, and the other one is going to be 151. And obviously we would be doing this for every single one of the exhausts, and we will be going 151, 152, 153, and we'd go all the way to 157. for now, we're just going to do it in one pipe to demonstrate. It's just creating a property called bone function and assigning the value of an unused bone function. Those go all the way to 512. So we're going to do a bit of weighting. It's going to be really simple. We have our two bones. We want to parent the second one to the first so that it's properly a chain, since the second one should follow the first. And what we're going to want to do is make the first bone of our jiggle chain follow the bone that we would normally want the whole thing to follow. In this case, because there's only one bone, our choice is made for us. It's going to be bone 003, because that's the one that determines where the shield position is. So we want that bone to follow bone 3. So the pipe is going to jiggle around the first empty, and the second empty is basically where we're going to be weighting things to. Again, names don't matter. What really matters is the bone name, so we're going to rename this to chimney jiggle bottom right end. And now we have to actually weight the pipe to that. So we're going to pick which vertices we want to move with the rotation. It's going to rotate around its base. So we're going to pick that segment of the pipe. We should also select see-through mode so that we can select vertices which are behind the ones that the camera sees as well. And now we're going to weight them all to the bone, the vertex group of the bone that we just picked, which is done by just naming the vertex group after the bone we're going to be moving after. And now we see weights, and we have an issue, which is that it's weighted 100% twice. So we normalize. You can unlock active if you wanted to normalize over all of the groups, but in this case we actually want to normalize with the selected group fixed. Clean is useful to remove vertex groups which aren't which don't have anything weighted to them. Like in this case, you can see that even if it's weighted 0, the vertices are still part of it, which is it's an issue when you start running out of vertices because of the count limit. So now we use clean, and we set the limit to a really low value, but not quite 0, so that it has some wiggle room to delete them. And now we can notice that our bone group is not weighted at all to bone 03. If we look at selection for bone 03, our vertices are no longer there, which is great. So there's other tools on the weight toolbox. One is limit total, which is again relevant because of the 4 limit per vertex weight. You set it to 4, or really normally the convention is 3 because the 4th weight is has peculiarities that I won't get into. So you limit total and then you normalize all, and now all of your vertices are weighted only to 3 bones. In this case, we don't worry about it because we don't even have 4 bones to weight things to. We just only have 2 groups, so it shouldn't even be an issue. So in theory, we could also, for example, do another CDC for the compass, and the procedure would be basically the same. In general, like we can pepper this thing with CDCs, and the procedure is going to be pretty much the same. If we wanted the chimney to jitter and jiggle a bit when the shield moves, we would do the same. We can do the same for the strap. For example, we would use a CCL collision capsule centered on where the arm goes, so that the strap cannot go into, but can only go outwards while still having physics. In this case, the strap's so small that it wouldn't really be worth it given it physics, because it would basically just move. It would be visually imperceptible and might even impact performance. It's not a ton of work, but you still have to be tweaking the values. You still have to be playing around with it. So it's not so easy that you would be just doing it for anything, especially for tiny things which don't have much impact on the way the model works. For big parts like the pipes, it's worth it, at least for us. So at this point, we have most of our objects painted. Oh god, that went through. So sometimes you'll notice that you have spare geometry where it shouldn't. I'm just gonna take the opportunity to clean this up and move this to the appropriate place where it should be. And we're gonna just join them with the section which has its other side. So it's now on one object. This should be fine. Yep. Now it's only one mesh. So at this point, we could actually export at this point, because we've done all of the properties are set and whatnot. But it's almost definitely going to have errors, because I already know that this mesh has errors, and in most cases when you're importing things from other games, you're going to have errors. For now, we'll just name it shield test, because it's gonna fail. And it fails. So to see which errors we have, we open the window, and most of the time the errors tells you exactly what you should do to fix it. Multiple different UVs per loop at single vertex, once you're making islands as seams and then splitting at seams. So what this is telling us is pretty much the how to fix this, and we're gonna basically do exactly what it says. This is happening because in 3D modeling you can have more than one UV point per vertices, but in Monster Hunter World it's one UV per one vertex. So we're gonna go into the UV editor and we're gonna see this issue at close. So we select all of our objects and we make, well, seams from islands is the name of the operator, seams from islands. And in this case we're going to notice that it looks like every UV point has a single vertice, so it looks like this mesh is unaffected, so we're gonna just pull our trusty error, and okay, our error says that mesh is 1.001. That one was safe. So we do seam from island, and we should be able to start noticing the problem. Normally edges around islands are the ones that show the issue. But if you're taking a long time and you cannot find it, another fast way is to just select any edge and select similar seams, and it's gonna select everything, but you then use Ctrl-I to select the inverse, and the only things left are now the seams that would leave issue, and that's where you can see that one vertex of the mesh is mapping to multiple UVs. In this case we use vertex split, and edge split is gonna split each edge into 2 copies of itself, one for each one of the copies. The thing is that this mesh has an issue with geometry, and you'll notice that probably shouldn't be a seam. Doesn't make much sense, and not only that, it's only visible on one side, and that's a problem of how this mesh was topologized. It's probably a good example of how bad it can get sometimes, because you might have, if you're using automatic topology when doing meshes, you'll probably run into this a lot. If you're importing things from another game, this is much rarer, unless they fucked up the topology really bad and they've exported it. Sometimes you get false positives and you don't really need to split along the perpendiculars, and you can just get fine by splitting along the outer edge, which is what I thought was going to happen here. So we can just you can control click to do a lasso, or you can just control click individually. In this case we're going to be selecting the edges that I think are responsible, and I'm going to do an edge split. At the end of the day, there's 2 tools for solving this side of issues. One is edge split, which is the one that I almost entirely use on this tutorial, and the other is called rip. Rip is the vertex version of edge split. You should avoid using rip unless you're absolutely sure that the vertex requires using rip. Rip is accessed by pressing V. We're not going to be seeing this in this tutorial because the cases where you need it are extremely rare, and edge split didn't work. So this is a mesh that we'll probably have to do some work on it. I'm not going to try to fix it all in here, and we're gonna use the lasso tool to try to do another go at edge splitting. Ctrl Shift lets me lasso deselect, and we're gonna edge split again, and hopefully this will fix it. And it looks that it's mostly fine, no longer multiple edges. We can select similar seam and then invert, and it's not fixed yet. So this is going to be an issue, and this is an issue that there's, at the time, there's no easy solution to this. It would require fixing a lot of the topology, and with the level of with how the topology is in the section, it's not something that's going to be easily fixable. You might come across this, and the solution is pretty much up to in a case-by-case basis. In this case, what I eventually noticed is that it only happens on one side, so we can just delete this side and copy over from the other side. And you can notice when I move the mesh that there's some severe issues with how the geometry is being basically folded on itself and whatnot. And it's weird because if you do the selection, it doesn't show up on the other side, even no matter how big it is. And it almost looks like it's fixed, but if I click and select seams and then invert it, the issue is still there. Why does edge splitting have issues when you do this? Because it affects shading, and it will be really noticeable if you if you edge split alongside a surface. So now we go into the next mesh, which should be relatively simpler to fix. We've got 8 instances of multiple UVs per loop. So that's going to be hard to find. So we just select everything, seams from islands. Then we pick a normal edge that's fine. We select similar, and then we are going to be, we have to be edge, not vertex. Select similar, seam, invert with Control I, and then we find the responsibles. And it's a point with an edge, and it's really the edge that's causing the issue, so we're just gonna edge split. And it looks like it's 4 points, but because it's probably symmetrical and it affects both sides of the mesh, that's 4 multiplied by 2, that's the 8 vertices reported. Next one is 007, which is the pipes. So normally whenever you have cylinders that are closed, you're gonna be seeing this, and sure enough, it's the 2 ends of the cylinder. So we're gonna click similar, yeah, it's the edges of the cylinder, edge split, and that should deal with it. So it's gonna be really visible later on, like what's happening when we're edge splitting cylinders. This will require reworking with wait, where the hell are the? It doesn't look like this has seams, and yeah, a cylinder without the seams, nice. So one of the issues with doing edge split on cylinders is that it's gonna affect the normals, particularly around the seam, and that's gonna require some manual fixing. And for that, we're gonna use a plugin called Yafne, yet another vertex normal editor for Blender. Yafne is basically required if you want to be working with anything that has seams. This includes body models in the game and whatnot, so you really should consider downloading it. So we've got those islands. Those islands connect to the main body and its repeated UVs. Most objects are gonna have simple cases. You get away with seams from islands. You select a seam, select similar. If you cannot find a seam, you select anything and then just invert the selection. And at this point, like, it looks like this edge should be innocent, and it's being caught up on the whole edge. So we can kind of deselect it, and it should still probably work. Edge split. But something that you have to be careful about is when you zoom in and you have that edge is guilty, so we have to split it, and now it's split. So that should be almost everything, and now I'm going to show you the issue with edge splitting. So this is something that you have to fix. There's no way around this, and it's that whenever you've done a seam, which is visible here, you can tell from the shading because the normals are no longer consistent around that area. Even if the object is it envelopes properly, after splitting the edge, it's gonna recalculate the way that the seams are shown. So for that, we're gonna be using Blender. Oh, we missed the strap. So the strap should be relatively straightforward. We just do the same procedure as always. Select similar seams, and that looks like too many seams, so we've probably got an edge that's not guilty. So we select one. Oh, that one looks like an obvious seam. So select similar, select seam, and then we just edge split around it. It looks mostly sane. It's important that whenever you're doing this procedure, you look at what's really being selected, because as I showed before, you can get false positive. You should zoom in to see if it's really an edge that requires splitting, or if it's some innocent edge that got caught up from how Blender selection works. And there's not many issues like the cylinders, because this one is relatively simple geometry, simple hard edges. And now we're gonna try to fix the piping, and this might take a bit of a while because it's a really consuming procedure. Yafne is pretty powerful, but it's a bit too powerful sometimes, so select similar seams. So one of the things that we want is that all of the hard angles, we want to keep them hard, and for that to be able, we need to select by sharpness and then edge split those as well, because in World we can only have one normal per vertex, while in Blender you can have, when you select hard edges, you're giving 2 normals per vertex, 1 per face really. So we're going to also be edge splitting those. If your model is good and it's already marked, you should just be selecting by sharpness. Otherwise, you should be using Blender normal tools to mark edges as sharp. That's a very manual procedure. It's just something that the model has already been done before. When I imported the model, I had already done that. I'll also take the opportunity to thank ACO for the model, since she was the one that made it and gave me permission to use it for the tutorial. So now we notice that we have a hard shading edge, which is not marked. So this could either be because I forgot or because that edge is already split. In this case, we can test that by using Ctrl Plus to expand the selection, and we notice that, okay, it's not topologically connected, it's its own edge, so we'll be fine. And we repeat the procedure. We select a hard edge, we select similar, sharpness, and then we just edge split. These are easier to find in Sims because you can just look for the light blue markings. We can review weights. For the most part, it shouldn't be too much of an issue. Most of our objects are weighted. We have this issue with the normals. At this point, we really could export, and it would probably export fine. However, we should probably endeavor to fix normals within bounds of reason, so let's focus on that for now. Shading and UVs, and this is the Yafne panel. Yafne allows you to merge normals when they are over the same geometrical location. So we're gonna merge distance, and you can notice that the tube has now been smoothed, but the problem is that the base now has issues when you're smoothing like that. So to be able to work around this, the workflow is not exactly fluid. You have to separate each part, which has to have the normals merged after you've split things. And the approach is going to be separate the part, do the normal merge when the part is separate, and then join everything back together. One of the ways we could also do this is because we have the original, which doesn't have the edge split, we could try transferring normals. And in most cases, if your meshes perfectly align, it's fine. And we're going to try to do it here. We're going to transfer shading by selecting the target mesh, which is the equivalent on the other object, on our first object. But you can notice that it's not transferring quite right. And this is because we repositioned our mesh a little when we were importing it, so they don't line up perfectly. Also, there's no guarantee that it will work. This is like the best solution. If it works, it's going to be just perfect. But if it doesn't, you have to go back and fix things by hand, which is what we're gonna do. It should also serve as a teaching opportunity, and we did it. So first thing we have to do is just separate each part of the mesh that we want based on the hard edges. So in this case, like, we're gonna get the tubing as its own mesh. We're gonna go into edit mode, we're gonna select the tubing. At this point, we could actually select all of the tubes simultaneously because it's going to be the same operation and they have no common vertices. So we're going to merge by distance, update vertices, and it still looks weird, so we're going to reset from faces, merge again. It looks mostly correct, actually. So that should be fine. We might get some weird effects, and we would have to play with setting the edges on the faces on top to smooth or whatnot, but that's mostly it. So we have to do this for every region where we have where we've made an edge alongside perpendicular. In this case, as I was saying, like, because the tubes are non-connected, we can just merge normals on all of them simultaneously, which is what we're going to be doing now. We select the tubes, we select locally, Ctrl L, then we separate selection with P, and we merge their normals, set from faces, and it should work mostly right. It's just the issue of those edges there. Those can be fixed by setting the shading of the faces to flat. I didn't think of doing it at the moment. You set the faces to flat and then you recalculate and merge normals, and it works just fine. I figured it out after I finished recording, though, so you're not gonna see it, but now you know the solution. So we basically have to do this for texturing. Helps you notice how it would light up, but in this case we don't have text. We have the text. The textures exist. It's just that I haven't set them up. We're gonna be doing this vertex normal merge, and the same thing. Like, if you get weird shading, you have to reset the normals and try to merge again from a better starting point. In this case, no amount of merging is probably gonna work because the issue is with how the base shading was set. So set from faces is gonna try to fix it, and because there's no UV seams, it works mostly fine for those. Still merge, and the issue reappears. At least it's consistent with the outside, so we're gonna leave it like that for now. And we should start working on the base about now. It's gonna be the same procedure. We're gonna be selecting regions which are non-contiguous. So for example, in this case, it's gonna be the If we merge now, we're gonna have the same issue in that we have vertices that we want hard edges next to vertices that we don't want hard edges. And sadly, even if we just do it based on selection and use Yafne, like set from faces, merge, it's not gonna work, sadly. We actually have to do the full separate the mesh and then merge the normals. Otherwise, you get these artifacts because, yeah, it doesn't look good. It's just an overall manual procedure. It can get quite annoying, but if you want your meshes, your models to look good, you should probably be doing this. And this is also part of why it's important to have good topology. I could open the UV editor as well and do my edits there, because selecting similar areas is all of these meshes are probably overlapping on the UV editor, on the UV view. So now that we have our ring separated, we just set from faces and then we merge the normals, and now it looks like a smooth ring. Nice. And now, because our meshes are no longer that like interconnected parts, we can just get away with selecting all, set from faces to reset the normals, then merge, then update. And now it looks nice and smooth and rounded, which is what we want. We still have those aberrations there. The solution to those at the end of the day is going to be trial and error. There's not many surefire ways to fix the normals outside of manually setting them, which you can notice that it's vertex per vertex. That can get tiring, but if you want you want 100% control over the things that you're working with, that's the best way. You can notice that it's also present on these tubings, but it's much less obnoxious just because of the way of the line on which the mesh is split. The Canon, for example, doesn't have that because the Canon is not a... While it's a tube, the way it's developed is different just because of how the UV map was done, so it doesn't have the same issue, and you can notice that there's no normal. There's no normals issue there because the UV is basically folding on itself. For the most part, you're not going to be able to control if you get lucky with that or no. If you're making your own model from scratch, it's better if the looping point doesn't have non-Euclidean topology and instead it loops back on itself. Obviously, the downside of that is that one side has to be a perfect mirror of the other, but for most cylindrical objects, there's some level of symmetry which you can abuse when developing the UV. So that's something to keep in mind if you're modeling from scratch. So we export again and we notice the same issue, which is that the edges I refused to cut because they were a face are still they're still seams, and it's going to be an annoying process to fix this. So the solution I ended up arriving to was just deleting all of the right side, because this doesn't happen on the left side, and mirroring it. But this will be a bit of a chore over how I try to fix this over and over, so let's just skip over this. So at this point we should already be ready to export. We don't have the seams issue anymore, and that's pretty much it. So one of the things we want to do before just clicking export is setting the materials on each of the independent objects already. There's some issues with the topology, and you might find this in your models. It's not ideal. You can notice how topology affects shading and why you should have clean topology if you're modeling from scratch, but otherwise we should be ready to export, and we're going to export shield test. And depending on how big your mesh is, it's going to take a little longer or a little less. So we go and no errors. That's just the errors from the last time, so we're fine. We should be good to go. So at this point we see that our file's there, so that means that we're pretty much done. Next we're gonna be going over materials. So we want each material to be labeled, this link to the emerald free. So we want materials which are gonna be different to have different material names, obviously. So we're gonna make the glass 5, the coal's gonna be 5. We're gonna make the glass 4, the coal's gonna be 5. Do we have anything else that would need special materials? No, we don't. For the most part, everything else is fine. The spotlight, we can make it its own thing so that we have more control over how it glows. But that should be it for the most part. Like, we're done. At this point, we can start working on our materials, on our textures, on the jiggle physics.